Mars occupies a unique position in our collective imagination. It's the nearest world with a solid crust beneath your feet, a place that feels almost familiar when described in certain terms. A single rotation takes roughly 24 hours and 40 minutes. Frozen water gathers at its poles, just like on Earth. The planet cycles through seasons just as we do. Its terrain features chasms that dwarf the Grand Canyon in scale and volcanic peaks that rise higher than any mountain on our home world. And if you spend enough time listening to the enthusiasts and visionaries, you might easily conclude that the sole obstacles preventing humanity from establishing a pleasant outpost on the red planet are a more powerful rocket and some determined engineering work. Construct the living quarters, transport the supplies, fill the domes with breathable atmosphere. Task complete. Time to move in. Now, I invite you to pause and truly reflect on that image, because on the surface, it appears entirely logical. It feels comparable to constructing a submarine, establishing a space station, or setting up a research facility in Antarctica. Difficult engineering, requiring substantial funding, but ultimately a challenge we can overcome. After all, we successfully placed human beings on the moon. Surely Mars simply represents a longer journey requiring a larger supply of provisions. Well, that perspective is entirely mistaken, and I can demonstrate exactly why, using nothing more complicated than fundamental principles of physics. The fundamental issue with Mars is not its distance from us. It's not merely the duration of the voyage, though that is considerable. The core problem is that Mars actively conspires to end your existence through roughly 6 simultaneous mechanisms. And the majority of these threats are not puzzles for engineers to solve. They are dictates of physics. And physical laws remain utterly indifferent to the size of your budget. They do not compromise. They simply exist, unchanging and absolute, regardless of your acceptance. Allow me, therefore, to guide you through the actual physical reality of Mars and reveal why those optimistic illustrations of quaint greenhouses on its ruddy plains omit some rather critical details. Let's begin with the most essential element for human life, the air you need to breathe. Here on Earth, we exist beneath a comforting, dense atmospheric blanket exerting pressure of approximately 101,000 pascals. This is what we term one atmosphere of pressure. Your entire physiology is calibrated for this condition. Your respiratory system expects it. Every blood vessel, cellular membrane, and fluid equilibrium within your body functions optimally under that specific pressure. Now consider Mars. It does possess an atmosphere. People frequently note this fact. Excellent. However, the average atmospheric pressure at the Martian surface measures roughly 600 pascals. Let that number sink in. 600. This constitutes less than 1% of the pressure you are experiencing at this very moment. To encounter equivalent pressure on Earth, you would have to ascend approximately 45 kilometers above the ground. That's not a mountain peak. That's beyond the cruising altitude of any aircraft. That's the threshold of space itself. That's the kind of extreme altitude where even military aviators become deeply concerned for their safety, and the situation deteriorates further. There exists a concept in aerospace medicine known as the Armstrong limit, named for Harry George Armstrong, a U.S. Air Force flight surgeon who identified this phenomenon during the 1930s and 40s. The Armstrong limit designates the altitude where atmospheric pressure falls so low that water will boil at the normal temperature of the human body, approximately 37 degrees Celsius. On Earth, that threshold lies around 19 kilometers up. Beyond the Armstrong limit, any exposed bodily fluids, your saliva, your tears, the delicate moisture coating your lung tissue will spontaneously vaporize. Not because they are hot, but because the surrounding pressure is insufficient to maintain their liquid state. The pressure at the Armstrong limit is about 6,300 pascals. The surface pressure on Mars is 600 pascals. Do you grasp the implication? Mars isn't merely below the Armstrong limit, it's an order of magnitude below it. If you were to step onto the Martian surface without a pressurized suit, the moisture on your tongue would instantly start to boil. Your eyes would swell. The fluid lining your pulmonary system would flash to vapor. You wouldn't simply asphyxiate in the conventional sense. Something far more violent would overtake you first. The clinical term is ebulism. Dissolved gases would form bubbles throughout your tissues, your body grotesquely distending. Unconsciousness would claim you within perhaps 15 seconds. Death would follow in a few short minutes. Now, we must also address the composition of that atmosphere, because even if some mechanism could miraculously compress it to a breathable density, you would remain in profound peril. The Martian air consists of approximately 95% carbon dioxide, around 3% nitrogen, trace amounts of argon, and a negligible fraction of oxygen, roughly 0.3%, effectively zero. On Earth, you inhale air containing about 21% oxygen. Your system requires a partial pressure of oxygen of at least around 16 kilopascals for normal function. On Mars, even if the total atmospheric pressure were magically boosted to Earth normal levels, the partial pressure of oxygen would remain catastrophically insufficient to sustain you. Furthermore, carbon dioxide at such concentrations is not merely an inert gas you cannot use. It is a direct poison. At concentrations exceeding roughly 5%, it induces headaches, confusion, and accelerated respiration. Above approximately 10%, it triggers unconsciousness and eventually death. An atmosphere composed of 95% carbon dioxide would terminate you faster than simple oxygen deprivation could. Therefore, the Martian environment assaults you from three distinct vectors simultaneously: insufficient pressure to maintain your bodily integrity, inadequate oxygen to fuel your metabolism, and overwhelming carbon dioxide to toxify your bloodstream. And we haven't even touched upon the ultraviolet radiation streaming through that tenuous atmosphere, unimpeded by any protective ozone layer, effectively sterilizing the landscape like an ultraviolet lamp in a laboratory. Mars lacks an ozone layer because virtually no free oxygen exists to form ozone molecules. Raw ultraviolet sunlight strikes the ground with minimal attenuation. If you placed a culture dish of bacteria on the Martian soil in direct sunlight, they would be rendered non-viable within minutes. So, obviously, you cannot simply step outside for a refreshing breath of Martian air. That much is likely self-evident. However, allow me to highlight a less obvious implication. On Earth, a broken window, a crack appearing in a wall, or a leaking door seal represent minor annoyances. On Mars, any violation of your habitat's integrity is not a simple leak. It is a catastrophic decompression event. The pressure differential between your habitable interior and the external environment approaches a full atmosphere. Every wall, every window, every airlock functions as a critical component of a pressure vessel. Your entire living space is essentially a balloon inflated to nearly 15 pounds per square inch, straining against an exterior that is effectively a vacuum. Now, contemplate that reality in terms of sustained engineering reliability. Every single seal, joint, weld, and hatch must maintain that pressure difference indefinitely. Not for a week, not for a month, but for years, for decades, if we are discussing a permanent colony. And any failure anywhere constitutes an unmitigated catastrophe. Aboard a submarine, if a leak develops, water enters relatively slowly. You possess some reaction time. On Mars, if a leak develops, your atmosphere exits explosively. The air screams out through any opening because the pressure gradient is so extreme. Depending on the breach size, you might have mere seconds to respond. This is not an inherently unsolvable engineering problem. We construct pressure vessels routinely. However, it fundamentally transforms the nature of the challenge. You are not erecting a house on Mars. You are constructing a spacecraft that simply never moves. And every spacecraft we have ever built demands constant maintenance, relentless monitoring, and possesses a finite operational lifespan. No one resides permanently aboard the International Space Station. Crews rotate, equipment is replaced, entire modules eventually become non-functional and must be discarded. Furthermore, consider a property of pressure vessels that is often overlooked: material fatigue. Materials subjected to continuous stress accumulate fatigue over time. Metals develop microscopic cracks, seals degrade, polymers lose flexibility and become brittle. On Earth, a building can stand for centuries because the structural loads are generally modest compared to the inherent strength of the materials. On Mars, your habitat walls are under relentless tension, constantly resisting that near-atmosphere pressure difference. Every thermal cycle, the dramatic 80 to 100 degrees Celsius temperature swing between day and night at certain latitudes, causes your structure to expand and contract, day after day, year after year. Each expansion and contraction stresses every joint, seal, and weld. On Earth, thermal cycling is a well-documented cause of structural failure in bridges, pipelines, and aircraft. We manage it through regular inspections, scheduled maintenance, and eventual component replacement. On Mars, who performs the inspections? Who executes the replacements? Using what spare parts? Manufactured from what raw materials? Supported by what industrial base? And consider this: the Martian atmosphere, thin as it is not benign. Mars experiences dust storms, not merely localized dust devils, though those occur as well. Mars experiences planet-encircling dust storms that can shroud the entire globe for months at a stretch. These storms carry fine, abrasive particles at velocities that, while lacking the force of a hurricane due to the low air density, are persistent and unrelenting. This dust coats every exposed surface. It infiltrates every microscopic crevice. It erodes materials. It obstructs filters. It diminishes the efficiency of solar panels. Over years and decades, this abrasive assault would gradually wear away at any exterior surface of your habitat. Seals that were perfectly airtight on day one might be compromised after a decade of dust abrasion and thermal stress. Now let me direct your attention to the second major challenge, and this one operates more insidiously. I'm referring to radiation. On Earth, you are shielded from the harshest cosmic radiation by two primary mechanisms. The first is our planetary magnetic field. Earth possesses a molten, churning core of iron and nickel that generates a powerful magnetic field extending tens of thousands of kilometers into space. This magnetosphere deflects charged particles, galactic cosmic rays, solar wind, the high-energy protons and heavy nuclei streaming in from all directions. The magnetic field sweeps the vast majority of them harmlessly around our planet. You remain completely unaware. The second shield is our atmosphere itself. Even the particles that penetrate the magnetic field must still traverse a massive column of air. The atmosphere absorbs and scatters an immense amount of incoming radiation before it ever reaches ground level. Mars possesses neither of these protections. Mars lost its global magnetic field approximately 4 billion years ago. The planet's core cooled, the convective churning ceased, and the dynamo effect shut down. And once that happened, a cascade of consequences ensued. Without the magnetic field, the solar wind gained direct access to the upper atmosphere. Over hundreds of millions of years, it progressively stripped away molecule after molecule. The atmosphere thinned. As the atmosphere thinned, surface pressure dropped. As pressure dropped, liquid water could no longer remain stable on the surface. It either froze or evaporated and was subsequently carried off by the solar wind. Ancient rivers dried up, lakes vanished. Whatever Mars may once have been, it experienced a slow decline because the engine at its heart went cold. Recent computational simulations have revealed an even more counterintuitive detail. A weak magnetic field, the kind Mars likely possessed for a period after its primary dynamo faded, might actually accelerate atmospheric loss compared to having no field at all. The weak field lines become deformed and pushed back by the solar wind, creating channels that funnel atmospheric ions out into space more efficiently than they would escape unaided. So Mars didn't just lose its shield. For a time, the remnants of that shield may have actively worsened the situation. Physics can be unforgiving in that manner. Today, Mars retains only faint, localized magnetic patches within its crust. Fossilized imprints of the field that once existed, these patches are far too weak and isolated to provide any meaningful shielding against cosmic rays or ongoing solar wind stripping. And the atmosphere, as we've already discussed, is extraordinarily thin, 600 pascals. That column of predominantly carbon dioxide blocks perhaps 1 or 2% of incoming cosmic radiation. Compared to Earth's atmosphere, which is like standing behind a thick lead wall, the Martian atmosphere is akin to holding a single sheet of tissue paper in front of a high-pressure fire hose. So what actually reaches the Martian surface? Two primary categories of radiation. First, galactic cosmic rays. These originate not from our sun, but from sources across the galaxy and beyond. Supernova remnants, active galactic nuclei. They consist mostly of protons, about 85%, plus some alpha particles and roughly 1% heavy nuclei. However, that 1% of heavy nuclei constitutes the most serious threat. These are atoms, iron atoms, carbon atoms, oxygen atoms, stripped of their electrons and accelerated to colossal energies. Some travel at a significant fraction of the speed of light. When one of these heavy ions strikes living tissue, it doesn't merely ionize a few molecules along a simple track. It plows a path of destruction through your cells like a microscopic high-velocity projectile. It severs DNA strands. It shatters chromosomes. Unlike a routine dental X-ray where the energy is low and cellular damage is typically repairable, these heavy ion impacts produce complex clustered lesions that your body's repair mechanisms struggle to resolve effectively. The second threat consists of solar particle events. Our sun periodically erupts with enormous clouds of energetic protons, usually associated with solar flares or coronal mass ejections. Most of these particles possess lower energy than galactic cosmic rays, but they arrive in overwhelming quantities. A major solar event can deliver a substantial radiation dose within a matter of hours. On Earth, our magnetic field deflects these events beautifully. On Mars, you simply absorb the impact. A physicist at the European Space Agency once calculated that a single day in deep space exposes you to approximately the same radiation dose that a person on Earth receives over an entire year. On the Martian surface, with the thin atmosphere providing a modest reduction, the dose is somewhat lower than in open space, but remains enormously elevated compared to Earth. Estimates derived from instruments aboard NASA's Curiosity rover suggest that an astronaut on Mars would accumulate roughly 0.23 millisieverts per day. Over a full year, that totals approximately 240 millisieverts. The average person on Earth receives about 6 millisieverts annually from natural background radiation. Consequently, on Mars, you would be absorbing roughly 40 times the natural radiation dose every single year. And here lies the subtle aspect that compounds the severity of this problem. Galactic cosmic rays cannot be shielded against in any practical manner. This is a critical distinction. Against solar particle events, you can take shelter behind something dense. Water works effectively. Regolith works. A few meters of compacted Martian soil would stop most solar protons. However, galactic cosmic rays, those high-energy heavy nuclei, when they collide with shielding material, they do not simply stop. They shatter. They undergo nuclear fragmentation, generating cascades of secondary particles, neutrons, lighter ions, gamma rays. These secondary particles can be even more biologically damaging than the original primary particle. NASA conducted detailed analyses of aluminum shielding, the material commonly used in spacecraft construction. Adding more aluminum actually worsens the radiation dose beyond a certain thickness because you generate more secondary particles than you block primary ones. The only materials that provide significant benefit are hydrogen-rich compounds, water, polyethylene, materials of that nature. But you require vast quantities of them, several meters of water-equivalent shielding. That represents an enormous mass to place between yourself and the sky, particularly when you need to protect an entire habitat, not merely a small shelter. So the radiation environment on Mars is not merely problematic yet manageable. It remains an active open research problem. NASA's own radiation health experts have stated, and I am paraphrasing here, that with currently available shielding technology, a Mars mission would inevitably exceed acceptable career dose limits for astronauts. We are not discussing a minor exceedance. We are discussing a fundamental conflict between the physics of cosmic ray interactions and the biology of human cells. Studies conducted on animals exposed to simulated galactic cosmic rays have demonstrated persistent cognitive impairments, memory deficits, difficulties with decision-making, heightened anxiety, and reduced rates of fear extinction, meaning the brain becomes less capable of relinquishing fear responses. The damage remained measurable 6 months after exposure, and this resulted from doses comparable to what a Mars mission would deliver. The researchers identified measurable reductions in the complexity and density of dendritic spines, the branching structures on neurons within the prefrontal cortex. That is precisely the brain region you rely upon for planning, judgment, and complex problem solving. Exactly the faculties you most desperately need when you are 8 months away from the nearest medical facility, and every decision carries life or death consequences. Imagine that the very environment you inhabit is gradually degrading the single organ you absolutely cannot afford to lose functionality in. That is not an engineering problem solvable with tools and welding. That is a physics problem in direct conflict with a biology problem, and currently biology is losing. And I haven't even addressed the soil yet. The ground on Mars is toxic. This is one of those details that often catches people off guard because soil sounds inherently benign. Dirt, earth. What could possibly be hazardous about dirt? But Martian regolith, the technical term for its surface material, is infused with perchlorate compounds. The Viking landers detected this back in 1976, and the Phoenix lander confirmed it in 2008. Perchlorates are salts derived from perchloric acid, and they function as extremely reactive oxidizing agents. On Earth, perchlorate contamination in water supplies is a regulated health hazard, even at concentrations measured in parts per billion. In Martian soil, concentrations are measured in parts per million, orders of magnitude higher. If you ingest perchlorate, it interferes with your thyroid gland's ability to absorb iodine, which in turn disrupts the production of thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones regulate your metabolism, your growth, your brain development. Chronic perchlorate exposure can induce hypothyroidism. In children, it can impair cognitive development. And on Mars, this substance is ubiquitous. It permeates the soil. It will be present in the dust, and Martian dust gets into everything. Martian dust is extraordinarily fine, finer than talcum powder. The particles measure on the order of a few micrometers. And because Mars experiences those immense dust storms, the ones that can envelop the entire planet for months, this dust is perpetually airborne. Any habitat will suffer dust infiltration. Any airlock will permit some dust entry. Space suits will become coated with it. And the dust isn't merely laden with perchlorates. It also contains iron oxides, which give Mars its characteristic red hue. These fine particles are potentially damaging to lung tissue in a manner analogous to how asbestos or silica dust poses hazards on Earth. Inhalation of fine particulates causes inflammation, fibrosis, and over time, irreversible pulmonary damage. So the very ground beneath your feet, the dirt you might hope to cultivate for food, is poisoned. And the dust derived from that ground actively seeks to infiltrate your respiratory system and your machinery at every opportunity. Any agricultural endeavor on Mars would need not only to pressurize, heat, and illuminate the growing environment, but also to somehow cleanse or process the soil to eliminate perchlorates before plants could safely be cultivated in it. Alternatively, you would need to grow everything hydroponically using purified water and processed nutrients, which brings us directly back to the fundamental question of energy. Let me shift focus now and discuss a factor that initially sounds more encouraging: gravity. Mars does possess gravity, approximately 38% of Earth's gravity. So you wouldn't float around. You can walk. Objects fall when dropped. It feels substantial. However, here is a question that no one can currently answer with any certainty. Is 38% sufficient? We possess extensive knowledge regarding the effects of zero gravity on the human body. We have decades of data from space stations. In microgravity, astronauts lose bone density at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per month in their weight-bearing bones. Their muscles atrophy. They can lose up to 20% of muscle mass within the first month if they do not exercise rigorously. Their cardiovascular system deconditions. Their heart shrinks slightly. Their blood pressure regulation becomes erratic. They develop vision problems due to increased intracranial pressure. Their immune systems weaken. Space station astronauts dedicate 2 hours each day to exercise in an effort to mitigate these effects. 2 full hours of resistance training and cardiovascular exercise every single day. And despite this, they still return to Earth noticeably weakened. After 6 months aboard the station, some astronauts require assistance to exit their capsules. Recovery demands weeks to months. Some bone density loss may never fully reverse. That is in zero gravity, with an aggressive exercise regimen. On Mars, gravity is 38% of Earth's, which is certainly preferable to zero. But is it adequate to sustain human health indefinitely? No one knows. We have never investigated the long-term consequences of partial gravity on humans. Not lunar gravity, not Martian gravity. Nothing between 0 and 1. We traveled to the moon, certainly, but the longest any astronaut remained was approximately 3 days. That provides no information whatsoever about the effects of a year, 5 years, or a lifetime at 38% gravity. Indirect evidence is not reassuring. A systematic review synthesizing what we know about partial gravity suggested that gravity levels below approximately 40% of Earth's are probably insufficient to maintain full musculoskeletal and cardiopulmonary conditioning over extended periods. Mars sits right at that boundary, perhaps even below it. And the review noted that adequate countermeasures, meaning exercise programs capable of compensating, appear unavailable with current technology. Consider what that implies for a so-called colony. You would be raising children on Mars, children whose skeletal systems develop under 38% gravity. Children who might never be capable of visiting Earth because their bodies never develop the bone density required to withstand 3 times the gravitational load they grew up with. No one has studied fetal development in partial gravity. No one has studied childhood growth in partial gravity. No one has any conception of what transpires in a developing human brain, a developing cardiovascular system, a developing skeleton within an environment where everything weighs 1/3 of its intended weight. This is not pessimism. This is simply honest acknowledgement of the vast scope of our ignorance, and the extent of what we do not know is immense. Now, I wish to address a topic that seldom arises during enthusiastic discussions about Mars. Energy. Every single activity on Mars demands energy. Heating your habitat demands energy because the average surface temperature hovers around 63 degrees Celsius. That's 81 degrees Fahrenheit. During winter at the poles, temperatures can plummet to 125 degrees Celsius, cold enough that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere freezes out as dry ice snow. You must continuously heat your habitat, or everyone perishes. Producing breathable air demands energy. The atmosphere consists of 95% carbon dioxide with only trace oxygen. You need to split carbon dioxide molecules to obtain oxygen, or you need to electrolyze water, or you need to operate biological life support systems utilizing plants. All of these approaches require significant continuous power input. Producing water demands energy. There is water ice beneath the Martian surface, yes, particularly at higher latitudes, but it is intermixed with soil. It must be excavated, heated, melted, and purified. Continuous energy. Growing food demands energy. Mars receives approximately 43% of the sunlight that Earth receives, due to its greater distance from the sun. Therefore, your greenhouse requires supplemental lighting, or your growing seasons will be protracted and your yields minimal. Plants also require warmth, a pressurized atmosphere, and carefully regulated nutrients. All of this is energy intensive. Maintaining pressure within your habitat demands energy. Your air recycling system, your carbon dioxide scrubbers, your humidity control, your temperature regulation, all of it consumes energy continuously. And operating all this equipment means you need to manufacture replacement components or import them from Earth. Manufacturing on Mars demands energy. Smelting ore demands energy. Three-dimensional printing demands energy. Every consideration loops back to the same fundamental question. Where does the power originate? Solar panels function on Mars, but they generate less than half the power per square meter that they produce on Earth because Mars is farther from the sun. And Martian dust storms can blanket the planet for weeks or months, diminishing sunlight to a fraction of normal levels. Recall the Mars rover opportunity? It operated for 15 years, vastly exceeding its planned 90-day mission, until a planet-wide dust storm in 2018 obscured so much sunlight that its solar panels could no longer sustain it. Nuclear power represents the alternative. Small fission reactors could provide reliable, continuous power, regardless of dust storms. But nuclear reactors demand careful shielding. They demand maintenance. They demand trained operators. And they possess limited fuel. You would need either to transport fissile fissile material from Earth or to determine how to mine and refine uranium on Mars, which would necessitate a complete industrial infrastructure that does not exist. And there is a subtle aspect regarding power on Mars that people frequently overlook. On Earth, if your power plant malfunctions, you summon a repair crew. On Mars, your repair crew consists of the same 6 or 8 individuals who also serve as the doctors, the farmers, the geologists, the engineers, the plumbers, and the cooks. Every human within a Mars habitat constitutes a critical system. If one person becomes ill, the entire operation is compromised. There is no external workforce to draw upon. There are no specialists on call. Every individual performs multiple functions, and they perform them within an environment that is physically exhausting, psychologically isolating, and, as we have discussed, potentially brain damaging due to radiation exposure. This raises a consideration that is technically not physics, but is intimately connected: human psychology under conditions of extreme isolation. Soviet and Russian cosmonauts who spent a year or more aboard Mir or the International Space Station reported significant psychological effects: depression, irritability, sleep disruption, interpersonal conflicts that became explosive within confined quarters. And those cosmonauts could look out the window and see Earth. They could communicate with their families in near real time or close to it. They understood that rescue was theoretically possible, that they could eventually return home. On Mars, you are so distant from Earth that home transforms into an abstraction. The communication time delay means you cannot engage in a normal conversation with anyone back on Earth. A question requires a minimum of 6 minutes to receive a reply, and up to 44 minutes at maximum. Attempt to conduct an emotional conversation with pauses of that duration. Attempt to receive counseling with a 20-minute gap between statements. The psychological burden of knowing that you are utterly, fundamentally alone, with no possibility of swift return, with no prospect of rescue should circumstances deteriorate, is something no human has ever endured for more than a few days. And those were the Apollo missions to the moon, where Earth lay only 3 days away. A Mars crew would remain isolated for a minimum of 2.5 to 3 years. Some proposals discuss one-way trips, individuals who depart and never return. Contemplate the psychological implications of that decision, not solely for the individuals who depart, but for the small community they would constitute, a community of perhaps a dozen individuals confined together within a space equivalent to a few apartments, fully cognizant that this is the entirety of their existence. This is all there will ever be for the remainder of their lives. Human beings are social creatures who evolved within groups of a few hundred, inhabiting open landscapes, possessing the capacity to physically distance themselves from conflict. On Mars, you cannot physically distance yourself. You cannot take respite. You cannot visit an acquaintance in another settlement. The walls of your habitat delineate the boundaries of your entire universe. The energy budget required to sustain human life on Mars bears no resemblance to the energy budget required to sustain human life in Antarctica. In Antarctica, the air is breathable.